In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a PHP framework from scratch. But first, we need to understand how an HTTP request is handled by a framework. Firstly, the server receives a request, which is passed on to a PHP script, which is normally an index.php file located inside of the public folder. This is referred to as the front controller, and for security reasons should be isolated from the rest of your application or framework code. That is why it is placed inside of the public folder and the rest of your code sits outside of this folder. Now, inside your front controller, you need three basic objects. Firstly, you have a request. This is an object that is instantiated with all the PHP superglobals. Secondly, you have a handler, which is known as the kernel, and this is the heart of your application. This takes the request and in simple terms, turns it into a response which is returned to the front controller. And lastly, you have a response object which is returned from the kernel and it sends the content back to the client that requested the information. So in this video, we will be covering the request and response objects, the kernel, we will be adding controllers, models, and views, which are all the basic building blocks of an MVC framework. Alright, so if we head over to our code editor, you can see we're starting with a brand new project. Let's first start off by creating our public folder. And inside the public folder, we will create our index.php file. And if you remember correctly, this is referred to as our front controller. Now, all we're going to do is we're going to echo out hello world. And we're going to start our PHP server to see if our whole setup is working. And we started off by typing php-s, and then we want to run it on localhost on port 8000. And the script we want to execute sits in the public folder under index.php. And our PHP server is running, and then we can go down to our browser. We type in localhost port 8000. And as you can see, our hello world is displayed on the screen. Okay, so next what we're going to do is set up auto loading. Because we're going to load a bunch of files, we don't want to do this manually. So we're going to rely on Composer to do the auto loading for us. So in the root of our directory, we're going to create a new composer.json file. And I'm just going to copy some code into it. And in this code, I've set up two namespaces. One that's called pixelfix framework, which was going to map to a source folder, which we don't have just yet. And that's going to hold our framework code. And then we've got an app, which is going to map to the app folder, and that is going to hold our code of our app that we're going to build on top of the framework. So let's just create the source folder and let's create the app folder. All right, and now we can run composer update, and that will basically create the composer.log file as well as our vendor folder. And if you look in the vendor folder, you'll see there's the autoload file. Now, back in our index.php file, we can now require this autoload file. But before we're going to do that, I'm going to define a base path, which is the directory location of the root of our project. And we do this by calling the dir name on the magic constant dir. Now, dir returns the location of the script that's currently being executed, which would be index.php, and the dir name returns the parent folder of that location, which will be framework in our case, and that is the root of our application. And now we can use that constant, and we can say require once, and we want to require the base path, and we want to require the vendor/autoload.php. And now if we head over to our browser and we refresh, you'll see everything is still working fine. All right, so the first class we're going to create is our request class, and we're going to do so inside of the source folder. So we create a subfolder called HTTP, and then in the HTTP, we'll create a file called request.php. This will be our request class. And we'll create the correct namespace, which is the one we defined in the composer.json file for our framework, which in this case would be pixelfix \framework. and then we add on the HTTP at the end. So we create the request class, and this is what we ended up with for our request class. I'll walk you through it just to explain what is happening here. First of all, we've got a private static variable called instance. We're going to use this because during the lifetime of our application, we only want a single instance of the request class to ever exist. So we're going to implement this as a singleton. Next, you can see we've got our constructor, which is marked as private. That means that only the create function within this class can call the constructor, meaning that it can't be duplicated from outside of this class. And then you can see next we've got a static function called create. Now this is going to check whether the instance already exists, and if it doesn't, then it's going to pass in the superglobals to the constructor and then set the instance as the one that's just been created. And then it returns that instance. And now if we head back to our index.php file, we can create a new instance of our request. So we can say request equals request create, and that is it. Now, in order for us to know what is happening, we're going to require a nice variable dumper that we can see the information displayed on the screen. So we're going to say composer require symphony /var dumper. And a lot of you would recognize this as the same one Laravel, for instance, uses in their application. So what we now can do is we can say dd request. And now if we head back to our browser and we refresh, we can see that we've got our superglobals listed in the request. And if we expand the server, you can see that is all the information for the current request. All right, the next class we're going to create is the response class. And we can go back into our source HTTP folder, create a new file called response.php, and let's create our response class. The namespace will be the same that we had before. And this is what our response class is going to look like in the end. We've got a constructor that's taking in a content variable. We defaulted to a blank string. We've got a status, which we default to 200, and we've got an array of headers, which we default to a empty array. We then have a function that sets the response code of the status code that we get. And then we've got a send method. This is basically just going to take the content and echo it out on the screen. And now if we head back to our index.php file, we can require this new, or create a new instance of this response. So we can say new response, and we're going to pass in a content variable. And what we're going to do is we're going to take hello world, create the new content variable, and we're going to remove that, and then we're going to call the response-send. And now if we head over to our browser and we refresh, we should see hello world on the screen again. All right, brilliant, it's working. So now the next class we can do is our kernel. So back in our HTTP folder, we create a new file called kernel.php. Put our opening tags, set our namespace, same as before. And we ended up with this kernel class. As you can see, it's very simple for now. We have only one function called handle, which receives a request. It does something, and then it returns a response. At the moment, the request is not doing anything. We're simply just creating a string. We're going to return that to the front controller, which is then going to use the response in order to send that back to the client. So let's head back over to our index.php file and get this working. So we'll take out that. We say we want a new instance of the kernel. And then we're going to say we want the response from the kernel handle method, and we're passing in the request. And now if we head back over to our browser and we refresh, we should now see hello world in all H1s, because in the kernel we added this just to show you that it's working. All right, so now that we have our request class, our kernel, and our response working, it's time for us to add some routing in our application. Now, in order for us to do that, we're going to use a package called FastRoute. The reason we use this is if we need to write out all the routing logic ourselves, because there's a lot of regex involved, it's going to take us a really, really long time. So we'll use this package, which is quick and easy to use, and it'll do the hard work for us. So let's get that installed. Okay, so in order for us to use FastRoute, what we'll need to do is first to create a dispatcher. And we'll use the simple dispatcher function that is imported from FastRouter. Now the argument there is a callback function, and the parameter for the callback function is a route collector, which is also, as you can see, it's imported from FastRoute. So we want our route collector. And now on our route collector, the first route we want to add, or we can call, first we call the add route method. And you can see the 3 arguments required is the HTTP method, then the actual route that needs to be matched, and then the handler. Now this is where you perform your actions on your code and send back a response. So let's create a route for the method get, and we'll do our home route, and we'll pass in a callback function. And what we'll do is we'll just take this code and we'll move it into that route. And now that should be it. Now let's dump out our dispatcher and see what kind of information we are getting back from it. Now, as you can see, it's got a static route map, so it means that it's added correctly. We've got a get route to the base URL, and it points to a closure, which is that 3rd argument that we've passed in here. All right, so now in order to use the dispatcher, we will get our route info from the dispatcher dispatch method. Now, as you can see, we require a HTTP method and the URI. Now, in order to get that, that's something that's on our request. So we can first pass in our request, and we'll get our HTTP method from our server variable, which is the request method. And our second argument is the request URI. So we can get that from the request server request URI. All right, let's just put this onto its own lines just to make it look better. But now, as you can see, there's a bit of a problem. There's a squiggly line underneath it, meaning that if you remember correctly, we added those variables as private variables. So back in our request class, we need to implement some getters. So let's create a public function, say get method, which will return a string. And then we can say return this server, and we want the request method. And we can do the same for the URI. So we can say get URI. That's also going to return a string. Return this server request URI. Now back in our kernel class, we can change this to get method, and we can change this to get URI. All right, and now we can dump out our route info to see what we're getting back from FastRoute. All right, so let's refresh our browser, and you can see we've got an array with 3 arguments. The first one is the status, the second one is the closure, and the third one is the parameters. So in order for us to get that information, what we'll do is we will basically kind of destructure that information into the status, into the handler, and into the variables from route info. Then what we'll do is we will return the handler passing in the variables to the front controller. So now if we refresh, we should get our hello world back on the screen like we do. So next what we want to add is something that is more of a dynamic route, because we're not always going to have static routes. We're going to be able to pass variables and stuff like that into a route. So we need to handle that somehow. So what we'll do is we'll just copy this route. And then what we'll do is let's say we've got some books, and then we're going to look for a book ID, and then the book ID should be anything with 1 or more digits. Now, this regex here is what is from the FastRoute website. I'll leave a link in the description so you can go and look at their documentation in order to see what it looks like. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to accept this ID in the callback function. Just make sure that whatever you call this variable here is what is matched to the variable in your callback function. And then what we're going to do here is we'll take that out, and we're going to say this is book number, and we're going to include the ID. So now if we head back to our browser and we go /books/ID10, and now you can see we receive an error. Now this error is happening when this ID is trying to be converted to a string. So if you remember, our variables that we get back from our route info is an array. That is why we are getting that error. Now, in order to resolve that, what we can do is we can call a built-in PHP function called callUserFuncArray. That's basically going to take your handler and execute it with the variables you've passed. So now if we refresh our browser, you'll see that this is book number 45 is what we passed in at the top. So make sure that it works. We'll just change that to 10, and you see we now have a dynamic route. All right, so the next thing we want to do is we want to move our routes into a dedicated routes file. Because as you can imagine, when your application grows, you're going to have tens, maybe sometimes hundreds of routes, and you can't add them individually into the kernel, because that's just a really bad idea. So let's create a folder in the root file directory called routes. And in that folder, we're going to create a file called web.php. And what we're going to do is we're going to return a multidimensional array. Now this array is going to have the details for each route. So our first route will be a get route to the home location, because that was the first route we declared in our kernel. But now we're going to create a home controller. And we're going to specify we want the index method. Now, as you can see, we still have a squiggly line because our home controller does not exist yet. And the second route we're going to declare is our books ID route. So let's just copy that. It'll still be a get. That'll go to the books ID, and we're going to create a book controller, and that will go to the show method. All right, so let's go ahead and create our controllers. Now in our app folder, because our controller is going to be part of our app, we create a new folder called controllers. And in the controllers folder, we create one home controller.php, and we do set the namespace as app / controllers, and we create our home controller. And for our home controller, we're going to require a new index function that's going to return a response. And for now, what we'll do is we'll just copy that information and put it in our controller. And now the next file we create is our book controller.php. Same thing, set the namespace is app controllers, and we call the class book controller, and we need a public function called show. And for this, we're going to require an integer ID with a response. And if we go to our kernel, we just copy this, and now we can return that. Now back in our kernel, we can remove these, and then we can say we want to include our routes. We can say include from our base path routes /web.php. And then we need to loop over our routes to individually add them to the route collector as a route. And then we can say our route collector dot add route. Now each route is going to return an array with 3 pieces of information. There's 2 ways of doing it. The first way is by simply saying we want the route, the first key, and then we want the route with the second key, but that is not a real good way of doing it. There's a thing called a spread operator, which is the 3 dots. Now, that will basically unpack an array into the variables it was made up of. So all we need to do is use a spread operator, and we can say route. Now back in our web.php file, we just need to make sure that we are importing our controllers like so. And now if we say go back to our home route, we're going to get an error because we are trying to call a function with our call user func array, but it's not an instance of an object. It's just a string. So what we'll need to do is in our kernel, we'll need to unpack our handler, because now our handler is being returned as an array. So what we can do is we can either do it 2 ways. Again, we can add our handler, unpack it as a controller and a method like this, or we could have added we can destructure it this way, controller controller method from the handler like so. But we're not going to do that. We'll just do it this way. And now what we can do is we'll say we want a new controller and a method. So now we are passing an instance of our controller with our method to the user call func array. And that now, if we refresh, should go back to our hello world. Let's just check our other routes. So we can say it is book / we'll make it book ID 12, and we still get our dynamic routes. Our dynamic routes are still working fine. All right, so the next thing we want to add into our application or framework is some views. We want to render a template onto a screen. And in order to do that, we're going to use a package called Twig. And we can require that with composer require twig / twig. And this is basically going to handle all the templating for us. It also handles security like the cross-site scripting, etc. So what we're actually going to do is in our framework folder, we're going to create a new folder under source called controllers. And in that folder, I'll just make sure we add in the right one. Right, should be under source. We're going to add an abstract controller. This is where we're going to call the render method for our controllers. So we create an abstract controller, which will then be available to all the controllers that instantiate or that extends this class. And we do this by creating a new controller, add it in the namespace, which is our framework namespace, controllers, and we create a class called abstract controller, and we create one public method called render, which is going to take let's say a string, which would be the template location. It'll also have an optional array of variables, and we can just default that to an empty array. And this is going to return a response. Now, in order to create to load a Twig view, we need two basic things. We need a loader, and we then need an environment, which you pass in your loader. The loader is just checking the location for the Twig template files. So in order for us to do that, we will create we'll create a folder called views. And in our folder, we'll create a new view called home.html.twig. So we know that it is a Twig template. Okay, and now we can say the template path equals base path / views. Okay, and then we need to pass this path into the file system loader. Then we pass in the loader into the environment. And then what we're going to get is the content, or the rendered content we'll get from Twig render. And we need to pass in the template, which is the name of the template we want, and the variables. And now we can create a new response. response, and we can pass in the content that we've just received from the templating engine, and we can then say return response. All right, so let's head over to our home.html.twig, and let's say we want an h1 that will say hello world, and we just add some exclamation marks so we know that it is working. And let's head over to our home controller, and instead of returning this, we can remove that line. We can just say return this dot render, and we want to render the home.html.twig file, but we also need to extend the abstract controller. So now if we head back to our browser and we refresh, now we need to go to the root location, and we can see hello world is now rendering from our template. Now let's just do the same for our book controller, which is that we'll extend the abstract controller. Instead of this, we can then return this render. We'll have a book.html.twig, and we're going to pass in the ID. So we're going to call it ID, and it's the ID. Let's create a view called book.html.twig. And then we're going to say, let's make it an H1 as well. Close the H1. And then we're going to say, this is book number. And in order for Twig to render variables within the template, you'll use the double curly brackets like so, and then you'll pass in the name of the variable without the $sign like this. So now if we head back to our browser, we can go to books/11, and we get our book number 11 rendered from our Twig template. All right, so the next thing we're going to add is some models. But before we do that, I think we need to add 2 more routes to our routes array, which is one route, which is a get route that's going to the books/create, because we want to display a form in order to create a book, because that book is going to be stored in our database. And our callback would be the book controller class, and we'll pass that on to the create method. Now in our book controller, we can create this method saying create. That's going to return a response, and we want to return this render, and we're just going to call it create book.html.twig. Then if we go over to our views, we can say create book.html.twig. Right, we'll just keep the naming convention like this, because we're not going to have a lot of views in this project, so we can keep them all in one folder. We'll just name them accordingly. And what I'm going to do is, in this create book folder, I'm just going to paste in a simple form that we're going to use in order to create our model. I just need to add a button That'll be a type of submit. And we can then say create. Now, if we go to our route, create, and we create our form. And now we can go back to our webs folder. We can add another route, which would be the post route to the books endpoint. And we're going to use a method called store. This is what we're going to use in order to store the actual information in the database. So let's create this function called store. And let's just dump out the information to make sure that this route is working is here. Now, if we click on create, we should get a, yep, there we go. Our process is working. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is to make the request class or object available in all the controllers that we would need it. And an easy way for us to do that is if we go back to the kernel, we can then take the controller that we received back from our route info. All right, so what we can do is we can instantiate this. So we can say controller equals a new controller. Then instead of instantiating it here, we can remove that because that's already an object. And then we can check, okay, if the controller is an instance of our abstract controller, then what we can do is we can call the controller and we can say set request, and we can pass in the request like so. Now we've got a squiggly line because that method does not exist yet. So if we head back to our abstract controller, now we can create that method set request, and it needs to be a request, right? And then we can say this request equals request. Okay, and then we just need to declare our variable at the top. We can say protected request, and we can default that to null. And we just make sure that it's nullable there as well. And if we go back to our controller, say our home controller, we should now be able to dump our request. So if we head back out to our browser and we go to our home route, we are able to access that request within our controller. And we can also check that if we go to our books/create, we just need to dump out the information in our book controller. So instead of say here, we'll dump out the request to make sure that we've get our, say, our variables as well, or our fields. This is a title. We can say this is a body. And if we do that, and then under our post variable in our request, we can see we've got two entries now. We've got our title and our body. So our information from our request is now available in our controller. All right, so the next thing we need to do is to create our database connection class. So in order to do that, in our framework folder, we'll create another folder called database, and we'll create a class inside it called connection.php. And we'll make sure the namespace is correct, which is the one we use, database. And let's create our connection class. And this is what our database connection class is going to look like. Similar to the request object, we ever only want one instance of the connection to exist during the lifetime of the application. So we're going to implement this as a singleton as well. Therefore, you can see we've got a static create function that checks whether the instance exists. If it doesn't, it it calls the constructor to create the new instance and then returns that instance. We also have a getConnection method that returns the current instance. With this connection class, we are only going to implement PDO using SQLite for this video. I've also gone ahead and created a database folder within the root of our project where I created the SQLite database file. I also created a config file which is going to store our connection string in order to connect PDO to our SQLite database. In order for us to get it working, we're going to create our database connection inside the constructor of our kernel class. In a normal framework, by this time you would have the concept of a service container, and therefore you would load it into the service container, making it easily available to the rest of your application. But we don't have the concept of a service container, so we're just going to do it in the constructor of our kernel. Okay, so let's go ahead and create the constructor. And what we're going to do is we're going to get the config from our database config file that we've created. We're going to then create the connection using the connection class that we've created. We're going to pass in the connection string. Only thing we need to do is now to say we want a protected connection class, and we'll default that to null. We'll also just make sure that this is optional nullable, and that should be it. So the next thing we're going to create is our actual book model. So in our app folder, we'll create a new folder called models. And inside the models folder, we're going to create a new file called book.php, which is going to be our book model. Let's set the namespace as app/models and create our. And this is what our book model is going to look like. We've got 3 private variables, one for the ID, title, and the body. We have a save function, which I'll go through in a second. Then we've got 3 getters and 3 setters, one for each of the ID, the title, and the body. Now back in our save method, we get the connection that was instantiated within our kernel class. We then prepare the SQL statement to add the entry into our database. We then bind the values of the title and the body to the variables we've provided in our prepare statement. We then execute that statement and then get the ID of the last insert ID from the PDO connection. Then we set the ID within the model itself. And now we can head over to our book controller and get this all wired up and working. So in order to do this, we instantiate a new book model. We then call the book, you can say set title, which would be request get, say, params, and we want the title. We can do the same with the body, and we can say we want the body, and this should actually be this request and this request. Now we don't have the get parameters method yet, so we'll need to go and set that up. So back in our request, we just create a public function called getParams, and we can say we want a name of the parameter that's going to return a string, and then we want to return this post dot it's an array, so it'll be the name of the parameter. So we can say this, actually we want to call it get post parameters. So let's save that and go back to our book controller, and we'll rename this to post params. And now just to make sure we've got everything, so we're going to die and dump our book model and see what happens. We'll just refresh this page. And as you can see, the ID is null. That's because we don't have that record in the database yet, but we do have the title and the body set. Now, in order for this to work, we'll just call the save method on the book model, and now it should save it in our database. So if we refresh, and there you go. The ID field has now been populated, meaning that a record has been added into a database, and that ID has now been added back into the model through our save method. And just to recap, we covered the request and response objects. We covered the kernel. We created views. We created controllers. We also added the data models into the database. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.